You touch that man one more time, Ethan said, his voice shaking, but his feet not moving an inch. And you're going to have to go through me. The entire diner went silent. Forks stopped midair. A coffee cup froze halfway to a mouth. Because the skinny blonde kid in the grease-stained hoodie had just said those words, those impossible suicidal words to Tyler Reed, whose father owned half of Flagstaff and whose fist had already split Ethan's lip open once tonight. Woman behind Ethan, barely breathing on the floor, was the man everyone in 3 states knew not to touch. The man they called Grizzly. If this story moves you, if you've ever stood up when everyone else sat down, hit that subscribe button right now and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Now stay with me. Every single word of this matters. There are moments in a man's life that don't announce themselves. No music swells, no slow motion, no voice from above telling you that what you're about to do is going to rewrite the entire story of your existence. You're just tired, you're just hungry, you're just a 23-year-old mechanic who worked 12 hours under a merciless Arizona sun, and all you wanted in the whole broken world was a cup of coffee and maybe a piece of pie before you drove home to a trailer that smelled like mildew and medical bills. That was Ethan Carter's entire ambition on that Tuesday afternoon. Coffee, pie, survive another day. He wasn't the kind of person anyone wrote stories about. He knew that. He'd accepted it the way you accept bad weather. You don't fight it. You just pull your hood up and keep walking. Ethan had the kind of face that belonged to the background of other people's lives. Blonde hair that never quite laid flat, always sticking up in the back from whatever hat he'd been wearing during the shift. Blue eyes that had stopped looking surprised by the world sometime around his 16th birthday when his father died and left the family with nothing but debt and a rusted-out Ford truck that wouldn't start in the winter. He was thin, not gym thin, not deliberately thin, just the kind of thin that happens when you skip lunch because lunch costs money and the electric bill doesn't pay itself. Or his mother Linda needed insulin, not sometimes, every day. The kind of medication that kept climbing in price while her hours at the laundromat kept falling. Every paycheck Ethan brought home from the garage got divided before he even cashed it, a column in his head, always running, always calculating. Rent, insulin, electric, maybe groceries if there was enough left over. Usually there wasn't quite enough left over. He drove a motorcycle to work because gas was cheaper than car payments. He wore a Walmart hoodie because it was warm enough, and who was going to see him anyway? He attended the community college 2 nights a week because somewhere underneath the exhaustion and the grease stains, he still believed, barely, but still, that things could be different. He ate at the Route 66 diner because the coffee was $1.50, and Marge, the woman who worked Tuesday afternoons, always gave him a second refill without charging him for it. That was Ethan Carter, a boy nobody noticed. Until the day a dying giant walked through the door of that diner and changed everything. Ethan heard the motorcycles before he saw anything. He was already sitting in his usual booth near the window, the one with the cracked vinyl seat that he'd learned to sit on at the right angle when the rumble vibrated through the floor. Low, powerful, the kind of mechanical thunder that you didn't just hear, you felt in your back teeth. He looked up. The man who walked through the door was the size of a door frame. 6'5" easy, maybe more. Wide shoulders and a heavy leather vest covered in patches that Ethan couldn't read from across the room, but didn't need to read to understand. Gray blonde beard that had been growing for decades. Hands the size of dinner plates wrapped in tattoos that told a life story in ink and scar tissue. This was Mason Hayes. This was Grizzly. Ethan knew who he was the same way everyone in northern Arizona knew, not because they'd met him, but because his name traveled ahead of him the way a storm front travels ahead of rain. You heard the name in certain conversations. You saw people change the subject when it came up. 3 states, that was what people said about Grizzly Hayes. He was known in 3 states and not for anything that made civic leaders comfortable. But the man who walked into Marge's diner that Tuesday afternoon wasn't walking like someone feared in 3 states. He was walking like a man trying not to fall down. Ethan watched him lower himself into a booth with the careful, deliberate movements of someone fighting his own body. His hands went flat on the table. His breathing was wrong, too shallow, too fast. There was sweat on his forehead, even though the diner's air conditioning was cranked up high enough that Ethan had kept his hoodie on. Something was wrong with him. Seriously wrong. Marge came over and took his order, and when she walked back to the counter, she had that particular expression on her face that people get when they want to pretend they haven't noticed something alarming. Eyes a little too deliberately forward. Movements a little too deliberately casual. Ethan looked around the diner. Everyone was doing the same thing. The couple near the door had stopped eating and were looking at their phones with intense fake concentration. Two older men at the counter had developed sudden deep interest in their coffee mugs. A family in the corner booth had pulled their children in a little closer and angled their bodies slightly away the way people do when they want to create distance without appearing to create distance. Everyone had clocked the patches on Grizzly's vest. Everyone had made the same calculation. Finish, not my business, not my problem. Keep your head down, don't make eye contact. Ethan understood the calculation. He'd made it himself plenty of times. There was a reason people learned to look away. Looking away kept you safe. Looking away meant you went home that night without incident. He'd grown up poor enough to know that getting involved in other people's trouble was a luxury that people like him couldn't afford. He looked back at his coffee. He told himself to drink it, finish his pie, go home. He told himself that for about 45 seconds. Then the door opened again and three young men walked in and ruined everything. Ethan knew the type before he processed a single specific detail. What? There was a way that certain men carried themselves, a kind of ownership, a casual certainty that the world existed for their convenience and amusement, and these three had it dialed up to a frequency that could be felt across a room. They were loud the way people are loud when they've never once been told to quiet down. They were laughing the way people laugh when they know the joke is at someone else's expense, and they're fine with that. The one in front was Tyler Reed. Ethan recognized him the way you recognize someone you've seen in the local paper or on the news segment that runs after the weather. Tyler Reed, star quarterback. Tyler Reed, scholarship athlete. Tyler Reed, son of Charles Reed, whose name was on the side of two buildings in Flagstaff, and who had been photographed shaking hands with every politician in the state at one point or another. Tyler was the kind of handsome that money polishes. Square jaw, easy smile. The confidence of a man who had never once had to calculate whether he could afford lunch. He was also based on the way his eyes were tracking around the room, very obviously drunk. His two friends, one wide and beefy, the other with a fraternity tattoo on his forearm, flanked him with the comfortable posture of people who'd learned that Tyler's wake was the safest place to stand. They got drinks from the counter. They laughed about something. They took up space the way only people who've never been told they take up too much space can take up space. And then Tyler's eyes landed on Grizzly. Ethan saw the moment it happened. He saw Tyler's expression change not to fear, which would have been the sane response, but to something else. Something that happens sometimes when drunk pride encounters weakness. Something ugly and opportunistic. Tyler said something to his friends. Low. Ethan couldn't hear it. His friends looked over at Grizzly and grinned. Hey, Tyler called out louder now across the diner. Hey, big man. The diner got very quiet. Grizzly didn't look up. His hands were still flat on the table, and his breathing was still wrong, and whatever was happening inside his body was clearly demanding more of his attention than the drunk kid with the quarterback shoulders. I'm talking to you, Tyler said. He walked over, stopped at the edge of Grizzly's booth, looked down with the kind of look that only works on people who are already afraid of you. The famous Grizzly haze. Don't look so famous right now. Ethan's stomach tightened. Hey. Tyler reached out and flicked the side of Grizzly's coffee mug, just barely. Just enough to be a provocation, just enough to be something he could claim was an accident if it needed to be. I said, I'm talking to you. Grizzly finally looked up. His eyes were glassy, unfocused, the kind of unfocused that Ethan, whose mother was diabetic, recognized immediately with a cold drop of dread in his chest. He's not drunk, Ethan realized. He's crashing. His blood sugar is crashing, and he can barely track where he is. Look at that, Tyler said, turning to his friends with a wide grin. The big bad biker doesn't look so tough today. Looks like the old man's about done. One of the friends laughed. Washed up biker trash, Tyler said, still grinning. You know how many of you guys we've had to clean out of the county over the years. My dad made 3 phone calls and half your little club disappeared. Ethan looked around the diner. The couple near the door were still staring at their phones. The 2 men at the counter had developed even deeper interest in their coffee. The family in the corner had gone very still. Marge was behind the counter looking at the space just to the left of Tyler's head. Nobody was going to do anything. Everyone had made the calculation, and the calculation said stay out of it. The calculation was rational. The calculation was self-protective. The calculation was by any reasonable measure the correct thing to do when a drunk rich kid with a powerful father was squaring up against a semi-conscious Hell's Angel in a diner on Route 66. Ethan made the calculation. He understood it completely. He stood up anyway. Later, much later, months later, in a different version of his life, people would ask Ethan what he was thinking in that moment, what calculation he'd made, what he'd expected to happen, and he never had a good answer. Because the truth was he hadn't been thinking at all, not in the way people mean when they ask that question. He hadn't weighed options or considered outcomes. He hadn't thought about Tyler Reed's father or the Hells Angels' reputation or the very real possibility that intervening in this situation could get him seriously hurt. He'd looked at a sick old man being mocked with someone who knew he couldn't fight back, and something in his chest had simply refused. That's all it was. Maybe a refusal. He stood up, he walked over, and he said the words that had already been forming in his mouth before his brain had any vote in the matter. Hey, Ethan's voice came out steadier than he expected. Why don't you leave him alone? Tyler turned and looked at Ethan the way a cat looks at a mouse it wasn't expecting to find. Excuse me, Tyler said. He's sick, Ethan said. He needs medical attention. Just leave him alone and let someone call for help. Tyler looked at him for a long moment, looked at the hoodie, the grease stains on his jeans, the split-open work boots, the cheap haircut. He looked at Ethan the way certain people look at other people when they're computing whether the other person counts. His conclusion was visible on his face. You don't count. Mind your business, Tyler said. Go back to your booth, grease monkey. This doesn't involve you. It involves me now, Ethan said. There it was. Those 4 words. It involves me now. He heard them come out of his own mouth and felt something shift in the room, not dramatically, not loudly, just a small tectonic movement, a before and after a door closing behind him. Tyler's easy smile disappeared. You got any idea who my father is? Tyler said. I don't care who your father is, Ethan said. Step back from him. One of Tyler's friends, the wide, beefy one, moved closer. Ethan saw it in his peripheral vision but didn't look away from Tyler. He'd learned that much from years of being poor and visible in the wrong places. You don't take your eyes off the person who's going to decide. Big talk, Tyler said quietly, from a guy with grease under his fingernails and a $20 hoodie. Yeah, Ethan said, big talk. Step back. Tyler stepped forward instead. What happened next happened fast. Grizzly's hand, massive even in its current weakened state, reached out and gripped the edge of the table as his body began to fail him more completely. His eyes rolled slightly. He was going down and he knew it, and there was nothing dignified about it, and Tyler saw it and moved to take advantage of the moment, leaning down, reaching out, and Ethan didn't think. He moved. He stepped between Tyler and Grizzly and put both hands up against Tyler's chest and pushed. Not hard, not as a blow, just a barrier. Just a body saying this far and no further. Tyler's face went red. You just made a serious mistake, Tyler said. Maybe, Ethan said. Step back. What Tyler Reed had that Ethan Carter did not have. 40 pounds of muscle, 2 loyal friends, a father with money and connections, a lifetime of winning fights because he'd always picked them against people who couldn't afford to fight back. What Ethan Carter had that Tyler Reed did not have. Something that had already decided it didn't care about the math. The first hit came from the side, the beefy friend, not Tyler, swinging low and catching Ethan in the ribs with enough force to fold him sideways. Pain exploded through his left side, and he tasted copper at the back of his throat, and the room tilted. He didn't go down. He straightened up. Tyler hit him next, a clean shot across the face that split Ethan's cheek open and sent sparks across his vision. The room tilted harder. He grabbed the edge of Grizzly's booth to stay upright. Stay down, Tyler said, not angry anymore. Something colder. Stay down and walk away, and we forget this happened. Ethan looked up at him through the blood running into his left eye. No, he said. Tyler's face hardened. The second round was worse. They worked him into the space between the booths where there wasn't much room to move and not much to hold on to, and Ethan took hit after hit and kept coming back to the same position between Tyler and Grizzly, between the aggressor and the man who couldn't protect himself. He was on one knee, his shoulder was screaming, his ribs felt like someone had parked a car on them. Blood from the cut on his cheek was dripping off his jaw onto the diner floor in a steady rhythm. He put one hand on the edge of the booth and pushed himself back upright. What is wrong with you? Tyler said. And for just a moment, just a fraction of a second, there was something in his voice that wasn't arrogance or cruelty. Something that sounded almost like bewilderment, like he genuinely could not understand why this kept happening. What are you trying to prove? Nobody here is going to thank you. Nobody even knows who you are. Ethan looked at him, blood in his eye, ribs on fire, everything hurting. He knows, Ethan said and nodded toward Grizzly. The sirens came 10 seconds later. Someone, Marge, it turned out later, who had slipped her cell phone under the counter and dialed without looking, had called 911 3 minutes into the confrontation. Tyler and his friends were gone before the first unit pulled into the parking lot. Ethan was on the floor beside Grizzly when the paramedics came through the door. Not unconscious, just done pretending his legs were working. The paramedics went to work on Grizzly immediately. Severe diabetic shock, they said. Another 10 minutes, and it could have been a very different outcome. As they were loading Grizzly onto the stretcher, the massive man turned his head. He found Ethan across the room, battered, blood-soaked, propped against the base of a booth, with Marge's hand on his shoulder and an ice pack that was already turning red. Their eyes met. Grizzly didn't say anything. But Ethan felt the look land in the center of his chest like something physical. Not gratitude exactly. Something older than gratitude. Something more serious. He didn't know what it meant yet. He was about to find out. 3 days. And 3 days of walking around with cracked ribs wrapped in an ace bandage he'd bought at CVS because urgent care cost money he didn't have. 3 days of going to work and coming home and not saying anything to his mother about what had happened because Linda had enough to carry and didn't need to carry this too. 3 days of thinking maybe it was over. He was wrong. It was a Thursday night, community college parking lot, late because his second class of the evening ran long, and then he'd stayed to ask the professor a question about the exam, and by the time he walked out, the lot was mostly empty under the orange haze of the sodium lights. He heard them before he saw them. 2 of them. Tyler and the beefy friend. The fraternity tattoo one wasn't there, which meant Tyler had brought someone he trusted more for this specific task. Thought you could make me look stupid, Tyler said. He wasn't drunk this time. That was worse somehow. Drunk Tyler was impulsive. Sober Tyler was deliberate. In front of everyone. In front of my teammates. I didn't do anything to you, Ethan said. He was already scanning the lot. No one else visible. No phones out. Just 3 men and the distant sound of traffic on the highway. You put your hands on me, Tyler said. Do you understand what that means? Do you understand who I am? Tyler, that's my bike, Tyler said, nodding toward Ethan's motorcycle where it sat chained to a post near the lot entrance. That's how you get to work, right? That's how you get to this sad little night school thing you do. Ethan's blood went cold. Don't, Ethan said. Tyler nodded at his friend. The friend produced a baseball bat from behind his back. Wah, no, Ethan moved, but Tyler caught him, grabbed him by the collar of the Walmart hoodie and yanked him backward and pinned him against the side of a parked SUV with a forearm across his chest while his friend went to work. The sound of aluminum connecting with metal and glass and then metal again. Systematic, methodical, not rage damage assessment, engine, wheels, handlebars, fuel tank. Ethan struggled. Tyler held him. The forearm across his chest was immovable. This is what happens, Tyler said quietly right in his face, when nobodies forget their place. When the friend was done, he came back breathing hard and satisfied, and they let Ethan go. He fell to his knees next to what remained of his motorcycle. He put both hands on the twisted metal and the shattered glass, and he stayed very still. Well, he couldn't cry. He was past crying. He was in the space beyond crying where you just breathe, where you just exist in the wreckage and try to figure out which way is forward. That bike had cost him 14 months of savings. That bike was how he got to the garage at 5 in the morning, and how he got home at night, and how he got to school, and how he made all the pieces of his carefully calculated life fit together. And it was gone, just gone. And the parking lot was empty and quiet. A moth bumped against the nearest sodium light. Somewhere in the distance, a truck horn sounded on the highway. Ethan sat in the silence and felt the full weight of his own smallness. And then he heard it. Not immediately, not right away. First, just a hint of it, like the way you hear weather approaching before you can see it. A low rumble. Building. Getting closer, and then closer. And then the parking lot entrance lit up with headlights. Not one set, not two, but many. One after another, filling the lot with the thunder of two-cylinder engines and the smell of exhaust and the sense of something enormous and organized moving toward him. Ethan got to his feet. Slowly, his hands were cut from the glass. 20 motorcycles arranged themselves in a wide semicircle around him, engines idling, headlights forward. He stood in the center of that light and could not see the faces behind it. His heart was hammering. He was certain, completely, totally certain, that he had just run out of runway, that this was what the end of Ethan Carter's short and unremarkable story looked like. Surrounded by a formation of Hell's Angels in a community college parking lot at 10:30 at night. The engines cut, one by one, until the parking lot was silent again. And then one set of footsteps, slow and deliberate, walked toward him through the dark. The man was moving easier than he had 3 days ago in the diner. Standing straight now, all 6'5" of him. Grizzly walked into the light. He looked at Ethan's face, the cuts still healing, the bruising, still yellow-purple around the cheekbone. He looked at the ruined motorcycle on the ground. He looked at Ethan's hands. He didn't say anything for a long moment, and then he did something that Ethan Carter was absolutely not prepared for. He reached out and pulled Ethan into a hug. Not a handshake, not a nod, a full two-armed embrace from a man the size of a small truck. And Ethan, 23 years old, cracked ribs bleeding, hands standing in the ruins of the one thing he'd saved up for, to felt something crack open in his chest that had nothing to do with injury. Grizzly stepped back, kept both hands on Ethan's shoulders, and looked at him directly. "You protected me when nobody else in that room would move," Grizzly said. His voice was low and rough as gravel road. "You didn't know me. You didn't owe me anything. You stood there and took it so I wouldn't have to." Ethan didn't say anything. He wasn't sure his voice would cooperate. "That means something to us," Grizzly said. "That means something real." But he let go of Ethan's shoulders, stepped back, looked at him steadily. "From now on, Kid Mason," Grizzly Hayes said, "you ride with us." Behind him in the dark, 20 men whose society called dangerous sat quietly on their machines and waited. Ethan looked at the ruined motorcycle, looked at Grizzly, looked at the semicircle of headlights. He was 23 years old. He worked at a garage and went to night school, and his mother needed insulin, and his boots were falling apart. Well, he had spent his whole life being invisible. And somehow, through one terrible night and 3 days of wrong choices by a man who'd never been told no, the world had finally looked at him. Not the world he'd expected, not the world he'd have chosen, but a world that had seen him throw himself between a helpless man and a bully in a diner on Route 66 and decided that meant something. Ethan took a breath. "Okay," he said. It was the smallest word he'd ever said. It was the largest thing that had ever happened to him. The word "okay" hung in the parking lot air for exactly 3 seconds before Grizzly turned back toward his bike, and the moment stopped feeling like a movie and started feeling like real life again. Real life had a way of doing that to Ethan Carter. The 20 motorcycles in that semicircle didn't move in some dramatic coordinated formation. Men just started their engines one by one, and a few of them nodded at Ethan as they passed, and one older biker with a white beard and a scar across his chin pointed 2 fingers at him in a gesture that could have meant anything or everything. And then the parking lot was empty again, except for the sound of engines fading into the Arizona night and the distant hum of the highway, and Ethan standing alone beside the wreckage of his motorcycle with Grizzly's phone number on a folded piece of paper in his pocket. That was it. No contract, No ceremony, no formal declaration of what ride with us actually meant in practical terms. When you were a 23-year-old mechanic with no bike, no money, and a mother waiting at home who didn't know any of this had happened. He walked home that night, 40 minutes, cracked ribs and cut hands, and the piece of paper folded and refolded in his hoodie pocket like a thing he needed to keep checking was still real. Linda was awake when he got in. She always was, no matter how late. She had the particular insomnia of mothers who raise children alone, the sleep that never fully arrived because something in her nervous system had learned years ago to stay on watch. She took one look at him and stood up from the kitchen table. "Ethan." Not a question, a statement of alarm. "I'm fine," he said. "You are not fine. Your face." "Mom." He sat down at the kitchen table and looked at his hands. "The bike's gone." The silence that followed was the kind of silence that has weight, that presses down. "What do you mean gone?" Linda said carefully. "Gone. Someone destroyed it." He looked up at her. "Tyler Reed. The Reed boy." Linda sat down slowly across from him. Her face did something complicated. "Ethan, what did you do?" "I stopped something from happening to someone who couldn't stop it himself," he said. "At the diner, 3 days ago. I didn't tell you because you knew I'd do exactly this," she said. And there it was in her voice, not anger, but something worse. Fear wearing the clothes of anger. "Ethan Charles Reed is, you understand what that family is in this county, right? You understand what that man can do." "I know." "Then why?" "Because someone had to," he said quietly. Linda looked at him for a long moment. She had the same blue eyes as her son, and right now they were doing what mother's eyes do when they're looking at their child and seeing every version of him at once, the baby, the boy, the teenager, the man sitting at the kitchen table with blood drying on his knuckles. She reached across and put her hand over his. She didn't say anything else that night, but she didn't let go either. Done. Yeah. The next morning, Ethan called into the garage. His boss, a heavy-set man named Dennis, who had been fixing cars and trucks for 30 years and had seen most things, listened to the short version of the story without interrupting. When Ethan finished, Dennis was quiet for a moment. "You need to come in," Dennis said finally. "I'll send my nephew to pick you up." "Dennis, I can't afford." "I didn't ask you what you could afford. I said come in." That was how Ethan found himself in the office of the garage an hour later, sitting across from Dennis, who had 2 cups of coffee on the desk between them and an expression on his face that Ethan had never seen there before. Something careful. Something that wanted to say the right thing. "I know the Reed family," Dennis said. "Everybody in this county knows the Reed family. Charles Reed has got his hands in every contract, every permit, every zoning decision for the last 20 years. He picked up his coffee. "What I'm saying is be careful, son." "He destroyed my motorcycle," Ethan said. "I need that bike to work." "I know you do." Dennis looked at him steadily. "Which is why I'm going to let you use the shop truck until you can sort something out." Ethan blinked. "Dennis." "Don't make it weird," Dennis said and went back to his paperwork. Ethan sat there for a moment. Something swelled in his chest that he didn't quite have a name for. "Thank you," he said. Dennis waved a hand without looking up. "Get to work. Bay 3 has a transmission job that's been waiting since Monday." Ethan got to work. He was under the chassis of a 2009 Silverado when he heard it, the specific acoustics of a Harley-Davidson idling in a parking lot, a sound he was already learning to distinguish from the general noise of traffic. He rolled out from under the truck and stood up, and there was a single bike sitting at the edge of the garage's lot. A man he didn't recognize, mid-40s compact-built dark eyes that missed nothing, sat on it with the engine still running. He looked at Ethan, gave that same 2-finger nod, then pulled out of the lot slowly. Not threatening, not announcing anything, just present, just letting Ethan know that someone knew where he was. He went back under the truck. 30 minutes later, he rolled out again, and the bike was gone and a different one was there. Different man, same steady watching posture, same nod when their eyes met. Dennis appeared in the bay doorway. He looked at the bike in the lot, looked at Ethan, said nothing. Ethan said nothing either. But the thing in his chest that had no name was changing shape slowly into something he recognized more clearly. Something that felt, if he was being honest with himself, like the first evidence of not being alone that he'd encountered in a very long time. He called Grizzly that evening, stood outside the trailer with the piece of paper in his hand and dialed the number, and half expected it to go to voicemail or be disconnected or be some kind of mistake. Grizzly picked up on the second ring. "Kid, the big man said. No hello, no preamble, as if he'd been expecting the call. "I wanted to say thank you," Ethan said, "for last night, he paused, "for showing up." "Don't thank me," Grizzly said. "You earned it. That's different. "I need to ask you something," Ethan said. "Go ahead." "What does it mean, what you said? Riding with you?" He looked out at the railroad tracks beyond the trailer park fence. I don't know what that means in practical terms. I've got a job, I've got school, I've got my mother. I'm not..." "Kid," Grizzly's voice cut through cleanly. "Nobody's asking you to change your life. You understand that?" Ethan was quiet. "What we're saying," Grizzly continued, "is that we see you, we know what you did, and we know what it cost you, and we know what kind of person does that. And people like that in our world, that means something. It means you've got people. Even though nothing," Grizzly said. "Stop trying to find the catch." Ethan almost laughed, almost. His ribs wouldn't quite allow a full laugh yet. "Get some sleep," Grizzly said. "And Ethan," a pause, "lock your doors tonight. The Reed kid is embarrassed, and embarrassed men do stupid things. But you won't be alone." Ethan looked up at the trailer. The kitchen light was on inside, his mother moving around. The refrigerator that made a sound like a dying animal when the compressor kicked in. "Okay," he said. "You keep saying that word," Grizzly said, and there was something in his voice that might have been warmth. "Good word. Go say it to a pillow." The line went dead. Ethan stood outside in the warm Arizona night and breathed for a moment. Just breathed. Let the air fill his lungs and let himself feel the strange shape of the day, Dennis and his coffee, and the shop truck keys. The succession of bikes at the edge of the lot. Grizzly's voice on the phone saying, "You've got people," like it was the most ordinary thing in the world. He locked the door. He slept. Tyler Reed was not sleeping. In the living room of his father's house, the kind of house that had a name that appeared in real estate sections as an estate with rooms that nobody used and art on the walls that nobody looked at. Tyler was sitting across from Charles Reed and being looked at with the expression, "Charles Reed reserved for problems that had gotten larger than expected." "Explain to me," Charles said, "how a mechanic from a trailer park is now connected to Mason Hayes." Tyler shifted in his chair. "I didn't know that's who he was." "You went after a Hell's Angel in a public diner," Charles said, each word very flat and very precise. "You went after the mechanic who helped him in a parking lot with a baseball bat, and you're sitting in my house right now explaining how you didn't know." "He was nobody." "He was nobody," Charles repeated. He stood up and walked to the window. "Tyler, I have built 23 years of relationships in this county. I have very carefully managed to keep certain understandings in place with certain people. And in 3 days, you have taken a match to all of it. I can handle it. You cannot handle it." Charles turned from the window. His face was controlled, but underneath the control, there was something that Tyler didn't see on his father's face often enough to be comfortable with. "Mason Hayes has sat across from men considerably more dangerous than you and not blinked. And the man behind Hayes, Victor Mercer, is a different problem entirely. Are you understanding the size of what you've started?" Tyler's jaw tightened. "So we're supposed to just let some nobody mechanic make us look weak?" "We are supposed," Charles said very quietly, "to be intelligent, which you have not been. Not once in the last 72 hours. He sat back down. "I'm going to make some calls. I'm going to talk to people. And you are going to do nothing. Absolutely nothing. Am I clear?" Tyler looked at his father. Something moved behind his eyes. An old stubbornness, the kind that gets planted young and grows crooked. "Yeah," he said, "clear." Charles Reed looked at his son for a long moment. He knew what that tone meant. He'd heard it before. He should have pushed harder. A week passed, then 2. Ethan fell into a new rhythm, slightly off kilter, slightly surreal but functional. He drove the shop truck to the garage. He attended his classes. He ate at the Route 66 diner twice a week, and Marge always had his coffee ready. And she never once mentioned what had happened there, because Marge understood that some things were better left filed under experience and moved past. The bikes were always somewhere near, not always visible, not always obvious, but he'd learned to notice them, the familiar shapes, the specific sound signatures of certain engines. Outside the garage in the morning, down the street from the community college when he walked to his car at night, once memorably parked outside the CVS when he was picking up his mother's insulin, and he came out to find two of them leaning against their machines, drinking coffee from gas station cups. And one of them handed him a third cup without saying a word, and Ethan took it and said thank you, and stood there for a moment drinking bad coffee with two bikers outside a CVS in Flagstaff, and thought, this is my life now. This strange, specific, impossible life. He started being invited to things. Not formally, not with engraved invitations, but Grizzly would call and say, we're doing something at the compound Saturday, come if you want. Or one of the men he'd started to recognize would pull alongside him at a light and say, there's food at the compound tonight, and then pull away before Ethan could respond. And he went the first time with the particular terror of a person who knows they might be making a mistake and has decided to make it anyway. The compound was outside the city proper property that the club owned outright, which surprised Ethan, though he wasn't sure why he'd expected anything different. There were structures, vehicles, a fire pit, and approximately 40 people in various configurations of leather and denim, and absolutely no interest in making him feel self-conscious. A man came over almost immediately, shorter than Grizzly, tighter, with the posture of someone who had decided long ago exactly how much space in the world he was entitled to occupy, and had arranged himself accordingly within it. Late 50s, silver at his temples, eyes that were simultaneously friendly and extremely alert. Ethan Carter, the man said. Statement, not question. Yeah, Ethan said. Victor Mercer. He extended a hand. People call me Iron Wolf. Ethan shook it. I know who you are. Good, Iron Wolf said. Saves time. Come eat. We'll talk later. There was food, enormous quantities of food, the kind of communal spread that happens when large numbers of people who like to eat have access to an outdoor grill. Ethan found himself sitting on a wooden bench between a tattooed woman named Rosa, who fixed motorcycles and had opinions about carburetor calibration that were both strong and technically sophisticated, and a man named Dutch, who was 63 years old and had spent 40 of those years riding and spoke about it the way people speak about a marriage, with deep love and no illusions. He ate, he listened, he talked more than he expected to. Nobody asked him about the diner. Nobody made him perform what had happened there or recount it for inspection or prove anything. It was as if the event existed as a given, a thing that had happened and meant what it meant, and what mattered now was simply whether he was the kind of person who showed up. He'd shown up. That was enough. Orsen was Iron Wolf, who found him after the food when the fire was going, and the conversation had broken into smaller clusters around the compound. The club president sat beside him on the bench and looked at the fire and said nothing for almost a full minute. Ethan waited. He'd learned in his 23 years that men who had things worth saying rarely rushed to say them. The Reed family, Iron Wolf said finally. You know anything about them beyond what everybody knows? Charles Reed, businessman, connected. Tyler's his son and apparently his legacy project. Ethan paused. Tyler destroyed my bike. I know he did, Iron Wolf said. I also know that Charles made some phone calls last week, had a conversation with the county sheriff, suggested that certain organizations might benefit from closer regulatory attention. Ethan looked at him. He's going after the club, Ethan said. He's trying to buy share, Iron Wolf said. He didn't sound alarmed. He sounded the way a chess player sounds when he's watching an opponent make a move he's already accounted for. Charles Reed has been managing this county for 20 years through a very specific mechanism. He gets to people before they get to him. He understands leverage. So does this mean? It means, Iron Wolf said calmly, that we need to be smarter than him, which historically has not been a high bar. He looked at Ethan sideways. How are you at keeping your head down when things get complicated? I've been poor my whole life, Ethan said. Keeping my head down is basically my entire skill set. Iron Wolf almost smiled. Good, that's useful. He stood up. In the meantime, don't go anywhere alone at night. Don't change your routine. Don't give Tyler anything to react to. And if he creates something to react to anyway, Ethan asked. Iron Wolf looked at him for a moment. Then we'll deal with it, he said simply. That's what family does. He walked back toward the fire. Ethan sat with that word for a while. Family. And it was a word he'd always associated with obligation and love, in roughly equal measure with the trailer and the railroad tracks and his mother's careful hands counting out insulin doses on the kitchen counter. It wasn't a word he'd ever thought might expand, might take in new people, might mean something larger than the original definition he had been given. He watched the fire and felt something loosen in his chest that had been tight for a very long time. The call came on a Wednesday morning, 7 weeks after the diner. Ethan was under a truck when Dennis appeared at the edge of the bay and said, "Phone says it's important." It was a woman from the community college financial aid office. She was calling, she said in a somewhat confused but professional tone, to inform Ethan Carter that an anonymous donor had fully funded his remaining tuition and associated fees. The funds had been transferred directly to the institution. There was nothing for him to pay. There was nothing for him to sign. The donor had requested only that Ethan be informed and that their identity not be pursued. Ethan sat with the phone pressed to his ear for a moment after the woman finished speaking. "I'm sorry," he said. "Can you repeat that?" She repeated it. He sat with it again. "Is there anything I need to do?" he asked. "No," she said. "You just keep attending." He hung up. Dennis was leaning against the garage door frame with his arms crossed and an expression that very carefully pretended to know nothing about anything. "Dennis," Ethan said, "I've got a Honda Civic in Bay 2 that's been waiting since yesterday," Dennis said, and pushed off the door frame and walked away. Ethan stood in the bay with the phone in his hand. He thought about calling Grizzly, thought about calling Iron Wolf, thought about calling anyone who might confirm what he already knew, which was that anonymous donors to broke community college mechanics with no particular claim on anyone's generosity were not, as a general rule, anonymous at all. He didn't call anyone. Instead, he looked down at his hands, the cut from the parking lot glass mostly healed now, just a thin pink line across his right palm, and he felt something so large and unwieldy that he had no category for it. He'd spent his whole life being told in 100 different ways that he didn't matter enough for anyone to go out of their way for, not cruelly, not deliberately, just the natural mathematics of poverty and invisibility. You couldn't be seen if you were never looked at. You couldn't be helped if nobody noticed you needed it. And then one night, on pure instinct and stubbornness and an inability to walk past something wrong, he'd stood between a sick man and his tormentor. And the world had looked at him. He went back to work. He fixed the Honda Civic. He fixed a pickup truck with a cracked radiator. He ate the sandwich Dennis's wife had packed and left in the office refrigerator with Ethan written on it in Sharpie. He was finishing the day washing his hands at the bay sink when he heard the bikes. Not one or two, more, maybe 6 or 7, pulling into the lot. He dried his hands and walked to the bay entrance. Grizzly was at the front. Behind him, strung across the lot, 6 other men. One of them was leading a motorcycle, not leading it by hand, but trailering it on a small flatbed attached to his bike. A motorcycle that, when Ethan got close enough to see it clearly, he recognized as his own. Except it wasn't his own. Not exactly. It was the bones of his own, the frame of the engine block, but everything else had been rebuilt. New tank, new wheels, bodywork he'd never be able to afford. The kind of restoration work that in the shop where he now spent his days would have run several $1,000s minimum. He walked up to it and put his hand on the tank and stood there. Dutch did most of the mechanical, Grizzly said from behind him. Rosa did the bodywork. Few others contributed parts. Ethan kept his hand on the tank. "I can't accept this," he said. "You can," Grizzly said. "And you will." Ethan turned around. His face was doing something he wasn't fully in control of. "This is too much. You already the tuition." "Nobody said anything about tuition," Grizzly said, his face perfectly neutral. Ethan looked at him. Grizzly met his eyes without blinking. "Right," Ethan said after a moment. "You need the bike to work," Grizzly said. "You need the school to get where you're going. You defended one of ours when you had nothing to gain and everything to lose. That's not charity, kid. That's a debt we owe you. You don't owe me anything. That's not your call to make." Grizzly said, not unkindly, but with a finality that closed the conversation. Take the bike, go to school, take care of your mother, and understand something. He stepped closer. Tyler Reed hasn't let this go. I need you to know that. His father put a leash on him, but leashes break. And when it does, you are not going to be standing alone in another parking lot. Ethan looked at the bike, looked at the men arrayed behind Grizzly. 6 men who had spent time, real-time skilled time, rebuilding something that had been destroyed for someone they barely knew because of a thing he'd done in a diner on a Tuesday afternoon without thinking or calculating or expecting anything in return. The refusal. That's all it had been. A refusal to walk past something wrong. And look what it had built. "Well, thank you," Ethan said. The words were inadequate, and he knew it, and Grizzly knew it, and neither of them pretended otherwise. "Don't thank us yet," Grizzly said. "Tyler Reed's got a bad ending in him. I can feel it. In one way or another, it's coming." He was right. It always came. Grizzly had a way of saying things that turned out to be exactly right, and the worst part was he never seemed surprised when they were. The leash broke on a Friday. Ethan knew something was wrong before he had any specific reason to know it. He developed a sensitivity over the past weeks, a low-frequency awareness, like the way animals go quiet before a storm, to the texture of ordinary days versus days that were building towards something. This Friday had a texture he didn't like. The air at the garage felt different. Dennis was quieter than usual. And when Ethan went outside at lunch to eat his sandwich on the bench by the bay doors, he counted 3 bikes positioned within sightlines of the lot instead of the usual 1 or 2. He called Grizzly. "Something's happening," he said. "Yeah," Grizzly said. "Just that. No elaboration. You going to tell me what?" "Not yet." A pause. "Finish your shift. Go straight home after. Don't stop anywhere." Grizzly. "Straight home, Ethan." The line went dead. And he finished his shift. He went straight home. He sat at the kitchen table with his mother while she talked about her day at the laundromat, and he nodded in the right places and kept his phone face up on the table and watched the screen the way you watch a thing you're certain is about to move. Linda noticed. "What is it?" she said. Not a question. Mothers didn't always ask questions. "I don't know yet," he said honestly. She looked at him for a moment. Then she got up and put the kettle on because that was what Linda Carter did when she didn't know what else to do. And the familiar sound of water heating was the most ordinary thing in the world, and somehow that made it worse. The call came at 9:14. It was Iron Wolf. "Charles Reed had a meeting today," Iron Wolf said. His voice had its usual controlled quality, but underneath it was something compressed, something that had been thought through very carefully before being spoken. "With the county sheriff and the city prosecutor. He's filing a formal complaint against the club nuisance ordinances, proximity violations, noise. Legally thin, but it'll generate attention and cost us time and money to fight, which is exactly what he wants." "That's not the worst part," Ethan said. He could feel it. "No," Iron Wolf agreed. "Tyler took a meeting of his own today with 2 men who are not his friends and are not his teammates. Men who handle certain kinds of problems for certain kinds of people." The kitchen went very quiet. Even the kettle seemed to pause. "He hired someone," Ethan said. "We believe so. Yes." Ethan stared at the table. His phone was warm against his palm. Across the kitchen, his mother was carefully not looking at him, which meant she was listening to every word. "What does that mean for me specifically?" he said. "It means," Iron Wolf said, "that Tyler has decided the social and legal consequences of handling this himself are too high and has found an alternative solution, which means we need to accelerate our own timeline." "What timeline?" "Come to the compound tomorrow morning," Iron Wolf said. 8 o'clock. "We need to talk about Charles Reed." He hung up. Linda set a mug of tea in front of Ethan and sat down across from him and folded her hands on the table and looked at her son with the expression she'd been wearing in various forms since he was about 8 years old and started coming home with scraped knuckles and stories that didn't quite add up. "Tell me," she said. So he told her. What and all of it. The parts he'd left out before the parts he'd been protecting her from, the parking lot, the bikes, the tuition, the rebuilt motorcycle Iron Wolf, the compound, all of it. He talked for 40 minutes. Linda listened without interrupting, which was extraordinary for her, which told him how seriously she was taking it. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "These men," she said finally, "you trust them?" "Yeah," he said, "I do." "Why?" He thought about it seriously because she deserved a serious answer. Because they didn't have to do any of it. The tuition, the bike, the watching over me at work. There's nothing in it for them strategically. It was just, he paused. It was just because of what happened in the diner. Because of who I was in that moment. And they decided that meant I was worth something. Linda looked at her hands, then at her son. "You've always been worth something," she said. "The problem was finding people who could see it." She picked up her tea. Her hands were steady. Linda Carter had survived her husband's death and years of medical bills and a trailer that leaked when it rained, and she had come out the other side of all of it still standing, which meant that news of hired men and biker clubs and county prosecutors landed on her differently than it might have landed on someone who'd never had to absorb a serious blow. "Be careful," she said. "I will." "And Ethan," she met his eyes, "don't you dare back down from this. Not now, you hear me?" He heard her. The compound at 8 in the morning had a different quality than the compound at night. At night, it was fire and noise and community. In the morning, it was men who got up early because they'd spent their whole lives getting up early, drinking black coffee and talking in low voices about serious things. Iron Wolf was at a table with 3 other men when Ethan arrived. Grizzly was there. So was Dutch, who'd rebuilt Ethan's motorcycle, and a younger man named Carver, who had the particular stillness of someone who'd done things in his life that had taught him the value of not moving unnecessarily. Ethan sat down. Iron Wolf put a thick folder on the table. "Charles Reed," he said, "has been running a very specific operation in this county for 2 decades. The public version is real estate development and civic investment. He's on 3 charity boards. He's been photographed with the governor twice." He tapped the folder. "The private version is somewhat different." He opened it. Ethan looked at the first page. Numbers. Property records, names he recognized and names he didn't. "We've had our eye on the Reed family for a long time," Iron Wolf continued. "Not because of Tyler. Tyler's a symptom, but because Charles Reed has cost people we care about real cost, real harm through his manipulation of permits, contracts, and law enforcement relationships. 3 businesses owned by club members or their families have been shut down in the last 7 years on violations that were created specifically to justify the shutdowns. A man named Pete Ochoa lost his auto shop in 2019. You want to know who bought the property 6 weeks after the closure?" He looked at Ethan steadily. "Charles Reed." Ethan looked at Grizzly. Grizzly's jaw was tight. "Pete was one of ours," Grizzly said. 22 years. He retired last year with nothing because Reed took his shop and the system helped him do it." Ethan looked back at the folder. "How long have you had this?" "The full picture, about 18 months, Iron Wolf said. "We were waiting for the right moment and the right mechanism. Federal attention requires a triggering event or a credible source of complaint. We didn't have the right combination until—" He paused, looked at Ethan with something that was almost dry humor. "Until a 23-year-old mechanic in a Walmart hoodie climbed into a situation he didn't start and gave Charles Reed a reason to overplay his hand." Ethan sat with that. "So I'm the triggering event," he said. "You're the reason he moved in the open," Iron Wolf said. "Tyler's attack on you, the parking lot, the motorcycle, the hired men, which is a line that once crossed creates a certain category of federal interest that Charles Reed has been very careful to avoid crossing for 20 years. He closed the folder. He crossed it because his son embarrassed him and his pride wouldn't let him absorb it quietly. "He made a mistake," Ethan said. "He made a mistake," Iron Wolf confirmed, "and we are going to make sure that mistake costs him everything it should cost him." Carver, who hadn't spoken yet, leaned forward. "The question is timing. We can't give them a chance to clean up or make the hired problem disappear before we move. It needs to be simultaneous, the folder to federal investigators in the documentation of the threat to you at the same time so neither piece can be quietly managed." "How long do we have?" Ethan asked. Nobody answered immediately. It was Grizzly who finally said, "We think a few days, maybe less." Boag. Ethan drove home from the compound with his hands steady on the handlebars of the rebuilt motorcycle and his mind running at a speed that his body couldn't quite match. He thought about Tyler Reed sitting across from men who handled problems. He thought about Charles Reed in a meeting with the county sheriff. He thought about Pete Ochoa, who'd lost his shop in his retirement, to a man in a suit who'd made 3 phone calls. He thought about the folder. But he was halfway home when a car pulled alongside him on the road. Slow, matching his speed, dark sedan windows tinted just past the legal limit. It stayed alongside him for almost 30 seconds, long enough to be completely unambiguous about what it was, and then accelerated away. A message, just a message, saying we know where you are. Ethan's hands tightened on the handlebars, and he breathed through his nose for 3 seconds, and then he called Grizzly without pulling over because he wasn't pulling over. Dark sedan, he said when Grizzly picked up, just pulled alongside me on Route 17, tinted windows. I know, Grizzly said. We're behind you. Ethan checked his mirror. 2 bikes, far enough back to be unobtrusive, close enough to mean it. He hadn't even noticed them until now. They're watching the house too, Grizzly said. Your mother is fine. Dutch is on the street. Ethan exhaled. This escalated fast. Yes, Grizzly said, which means Iron Wolf needs to move faster than we planned. Keep going home. Act normal. Define normal. Like a man who doesn't know he's being watched, Grizzly said, which, for the record, you should know you're handling better than most people would. I'm terrified, Ethan said. I know you are, Grizzly said. Keep going. He kept going. The next 36 hours were the longest of Ethan's life. He went to work. He fixed cars. He ate his lunch. He talked to Dennis about a carburetor and whether the Cardinals had any realistic playoff chances and the price of wholesale parts going up again. He performed normalcy with the focus of a man performing surgery because Iron Wolf had been clear. Anything that looked like fear or flight would accelerate their timeline and compress Iron Wolf's options. So Ethan Carter, 23 years old, went about his life with a dark sedan rotating through his periphery and 2 bikers at all times within line of sight, and he fixed cars and went to class and ate dinner with his mother and slept not well but enough and waited. He was at the garage on the second afternoon when his phone buzzed with a text from a number he didn't recognize. It said, "You should have stayed in your booth." He stared at it. Then he forwarded it to Iron Wolf without responding, put his phone in his pocket, and went back to the transmission he was rebuilding. 10 minutes later, Iron Wolf texted back 2 words, "Perfect, thank you." Ethan understood then. The text was a gift documentation timestamp traceable. Tyler or his people had just handed them something they didn't need to manufacture. The arrogance of men who believed they were untouchable had produced, as it so often did, a mistake they didn't know they'd made. He almost smiled. Almost. Then Dennis appeared in the bay with his phone held out. His face was strange, not afraid, but the face of a man recalibrating. "It's for you," he said. "Says his name is Victor Mercer." Ethan took the phone. "Iron Wolf." "Tonight," Iron Wolf said. "It's happening tonight. I need you somewhere safe at 9 o'clock. Not home." "Why not home?" A pause that lasted exactly long enough to be alarming. "Because we believe they're planning to move on you tonight, and we want them to find an empty house while we're busy elsewhere." Ethan looked at Dennis. Dennis was looking back at him with the expression of a man who had heard enough of one half of a conversation to understand the other half. "My mother," Ethan said. "Already handled," Iron Wolf said. "Grizzly's picking her up in an hour. She'll be at the compound. She's fine." Another pause. "She was actually pretty calm about it, which tells me something about where you learned your nerves." Despite everything, Ethan felt something move through him that was almost a laugh. "Where do you want me?" "The garage," Iron Wolf said. "Stay with Dennis. Don't leave. We'll call you when it's done." "What's happening tonight specifically?" "I'm walking into the Pinnacle Country Club," Iron Wolf said, "with the folder, and I'm going to have a conversation with Charles Reed that he should have had with someone 20 years ago." The line went dead. Dennis lowered himself onto the stool he kept in the corner of the bay office and crossed his arms and looked at Ethan with 30 years of quiet, unshowy life experience on his face. "Well," Dennis said. "Yeah," Ethan said. "You hungry?" "Not really. I'll order pizza anyway," Dennis said and reached for his phone. The Pinnacle Country Club was the kind of place that existed to remind its members that they had arrived somewhere and to remind everyone else that they hadn't. Charles Reed ate there every Friday evening, Had for 11 years. Same table, same scotch, same performance of a man who had nothing to worry about. Iron Wolf walked in at 8:47. He was alone. He wore clean clothes, not a suit but clean, and carried the black folder under one arm, and moved through the room with the unhurried authority of a man who had decided something and was arriving to deliver his decision. The maitre d' started toward him, and Iron Wolf looked at him once, and the maitre d' stopped. He found Charles Reed at his usual table. Reed looked up. Blonde, and for the first time in a very long time, Charles Reed did not manage his expression fast enough. Something passed across his face, surprise, and underneath the surprise, the early cold edge of something else, before the control slid back into place. Mr. Mercer, Charles said. His voice was level. Impressive, really. This is an unusual venue for... I won't take much of your time, Iron Wolf said. He sat down without being invited, set the folder on the table between them. I want to show you something. Charles looked at the folder, did not touch it. I'm having dinner, he said. You'll still be having dinner in 10 minutes, Iron Wolf said. This will only take 5. He opened the folder to the first page and turned it to face Charles. The Ochoa property, 2019. You want to tell me how a violation complaint filed on a Tuesday resulted in closure by Thursday and your purchase offer on the Friday? Charles's jaw tightened fractionally. That's a matter of public record. So is this, Iron Wolf said, turning to the next page. The Harrison contract, the Millbrook rezoning, the payments to Commissioner Dalton in 2021 that weren't payments. Technically, they were consulting fees, which is very creative. Charles, it really is. He turned another page. And this is my personal favorite. The shell company in Nevada that holds 4 properties that were acquired immediately following code enforcement actions that you requested and that your city council allies pushed through. Listen, the table was very quiet. Charles Reed looked at the folder the way a man looks at something he thought was buried. You have no standing to... I'm not a prosecutor, Iron Wolf said pleasantly. You're right, I have no standing to do anything. He closed the folder, slid it across the table until it rested in front of Charles. But the FBI field office in Phoenix does, as does the investigative team at the Arizona Republic that's been working a corruption piece on county contracting for the last 8 months and is, as of this week, looking for a specific hook to take it from good story to great story. He folded his hands on the table. The folder stays with you. I have copies that are currently sitting with 3 people who have instructions about what to do with them if certain things happen. Charles Reed looked at Iron Wolf for a long moment. Whatever was on his face now was not performance. It was calculation. The raw, exposed calculation of a man running numbers in real time. What do you want? Charles said quietly. I want Tyler to disappear, Iron Wolf said. From this county, from Ethan Carter's life, from the orbit of anyone connected to us. I want the men Tyler hired to stand down tonight and every night after. I want the complaint to the sheriff's office withdrawn, and I want Pete Ochoa compensated fairly for what you took from him. He let that sit. In exchange, the copies stay where they are, and the Arizona Republic keeps working on other stories. And if I refuse... But the Iron Wolf stood up, straightened his jacket, picked up nothing because he'd left nothing to pick up. Then you should probably not make reservations here next Friday, he said, because I don't think you'll be in a position to keep them. He walked out. He was in the parking lot reaching for his keys when his phone rang. It was Grizzly. Reed just made 3 calls, Grizzly said. He had a man inside, had always had a man inside in the peripheral staff of the country club, one of the invisible people that powerful men never thought to account for. First call to Tyler, second call to the men Tyler hired, third call to his lawyer. And, Iron Wolf said, Tyler just texted those men to stand down, Grizzly said. Lawyers have been told to prepare to withdraw the complaint. Iron Wolf was quiet for a moment. He folded, he said. He folded, Grizzly confirmed. Good. Iron Wolf unlocked his car. Call Ethan. Ethan's phone rang at 9:41. He was sitting on the floor of Dennis's Bay office with his back against the wall and a cup of Dennis's terrible coffee going cold in his hand, and the phone rang, and he looked at the screen and it said Grizzly, and he picked up. It's done, Grizzly said. Ethan closed his eyes. Your mother's at the compound. She's eaten 2 plates of food and apparently won an argument with Dutch about diesel engines, so she's fine. A pause. We're coming to get you. Ethan sat on the floor of the garage with his eyes closed and the phone against his ear and said nothing for a moment. Ethan, Grizzly said. Yeah, Ethan said. I'm here. You okay? He thought about that question seriously. He thought about the dark sedan on Route 17, the threatening text, his mother being moved to a compound outside the city, while a man in clean clothes sat across from the most powerful man in the county and quietly dismantled 30 years of untouchability with a black folder on a dinner table. He thought about Tyler Reed, who had started all of this because a nobody mechanic in a Walmart hoodie had refused to move out of the way. Yeah, Ethan said, I think I am. Good, Grizzly said, because it's not over. Ethan opened his eyes. What do you mean it's not over? Charles folded, Grizzly said, but Tyler didn't make those calls himself. His father made them for him, and Tyler doesn't know yet what his father gave up to make them. A beat. When he finds out, he's going to be angry. And Tyler Reed angry and cornered is a different problem than Tyler Reed arrogant and untouchable. Ethan got to his feet. Across the bay, Dennis looked up from the magazine he'd been pretending to read. How much worse, Ethan said. Cornered men, Grizzly said slowly, do the thing they should never do. They stop calculating and start reacting. And a man who stops calculating does something that can't be walked back. He paused. I've seen it before. It never ends clean. So what do? We wait, Grizzly said, and we make sure when it happens, we're ready. Ethan looked at Dennis. Dennis shrugged in the specific way of men who have decided to follow someone else's lead without any drama about it. The bikes were outside. He could hear them idling in the lot. The sound over these past weeks had become the most reliable sound in his life, steadier than the railroad tracks, warmer than the hum of the trailer park generator, more constant than anything he had had before. He walked out to meet them. Grizzly had been right about one thing his entire life. The most dangerous moment wasn't the confrontation you could see coming. It was the one that arrived after you'd let yourself believe the worst was over. Ethan spent 3 days in something close to peace. Not full peace. He wasn't built for full peace, and the weeks behind him had rewired something in his nervous system that wasn't going back to factory settings anytime soon, but a functional breathing version of it. He rode to work on the rebuilt motorcycle and felt the engine under him and thought about how Dutch's hands had rebuilt that machine, the same way his own hands rebuilt engines all day, with knowledge and patience, and the particular care of someone who understood that things could be fixed if you were willing to do the work. He ate dinner with his mother, who had returned from the compound with opinions about Iron Wolf's organizational skills that were mostly positive and opinions about the compound's coffee that were not. He went to his Tuesday night class and sat in the 3rd row and took notes on contract law and thought that 3 months ago, this classroom had felt like the outer edge of what was possible for him. And now it felt like the beginning of something he couldn't yet name. He slept better than he had in months. He should have known that was a sign. The call came on a Thursday morning early. Ethan was still at the trailer, lacing his boots at the kitchen table when his phone lit up with Iron Wolf's name. Tyler knows, Iron Wolf said. Ethan's fingers stopped moving. Knows what specifically, he said. Everything his father gave up, the withdrawn complaint, the stand-down order to the men he'd hired, the agreement about Pete Ochoa. Iron Wolf's voice was controlled but moving faster than usual, which for Victor Mercer was the equivalent of shouting. Charles told him last night. Apparently he thought it was better for Tyler to hear it from him than to find out through other channels. He was wrong about that. How bad was it? According to the source in the household, Tyler put a hole in the wall of the study. Then he left. A pause. He hasn't been home since. Ethan sat very still. Where is he? That's what we're working on, Iron Wolf said. Listen to me carefully. Do not go to the garage today. Do not go anywhere routine. Tyler's been humiliated in a way that a man like him processes very specifically. He doesn't go quiet, he goes nuclear. And when he goes nuclear, he doesn't think, which makes him unpredictable in a way that's more dangerous than when he was calculating. I can't just stop living my life. I'm not asking you to stop living it, Iron Wolf said. I'm asking you to live it somewhere we can control the geography for one day while we locate him. A beat. One day. Can you do that? Ethan looked at his half-laced boot, looked at his mother in the kitchen doorway, watching him with the quiet attentiveness of a woman who had learned to read the temperature of a room from across it. Yeah, he said, one day. Now he called Dennis, who received the information with minimal commentary, and told him the Silverado in Bay 2 would wait and to stay safe. He told his mother enough of it to justify why he was staying home, which meant he told her almost all of it, because Linda Carter had a finely calibrated detector for incomplete truths, and operating it on his mother felt like a waste of both their time at this point. She listened. She poured coffee. She sat down across from him. This boy, she said, not a question, a verdict. The word boy landing with a specific weight that only mothers can give it, the weight of someone looking at a grown man and seeing with perfect clarity that his behavior is smaller than his age. Yes, Ethan said. He's going to do something stupid. That's what everyone thinks. Linda wrapped both hands around her mug. What does your gut say? Ethan thought about Tyler Reed's face in the diner, in the parking lot, the particular quality of his certainty, the absolute unquestioned expectation that the world would rearrange itself to accommodate his anger. He thought about what that kind of certainty did when it met an immovable obstacle for the first time, when the father who had always cleaned up the mess instead became the source of the mess. My gut says he's not coming for the club, Ethan said slowly. He doesn't have the nerve for that, and he knows it. He's coming for me. He looked at his mother. Because I'm the one he can still tell himself he should have handled differently. I'm the one where the story isn't finished in his head. Linda looked at him for a long moment. Then you need to finish it, she said quietly. He almost asked her what she meant. He didn't ask because he already knew. Oh, hey. Yeah, Dutch called at noon. Dutch didn't call often. He was a man who communicated primarily in nods and the quality of his mechanical work. So when his name appeared on Ethan's screen, Ethan picked up immediately. Found his car, Dutch said, no preamble. Parked outside a bar on Camelback that's been open since 10 this morning. How long has he been there? Long enough, Dutch said. He's got somebody with him, not the friends from before, somebody older. Don't recognize him. You're watching the bar. Have been for 2 hours, Dutch said mildly. Ethan stood up from the couch. Dutch, you don't need to. Already doing it. Dutch said with the same tone a man uses when he's telling you it's raining, not a declaration, just a fact about the current state of the world. Wolf knows. He's positioning people. Just wanted you to hear it from a voice you know. Thank you, Ethan said. Don't thank me. Me, Dutch said. Buy me a beer sometime when this is settled. He hung up. Ethan told his mother. She nodded. She picked up her library book from the coffee table and opened it to her bookmark and began reading, which was Linda Carter's version of Standing Firm, the deliberate performance of calm as an act of will. He sat on the couch and watched the clock. At 2:15, Tyler left the bar. Grizzly texted, he's moving, stay put. On at 2:40, another text. He stopped at a hardware store. We have visual. At 3:03, he's heading your direction, not home. Your direction. Ethan's phone rang. Grizzly. I need you to listen, Grizzly said, and his voice had a quality Ethan had never heard in it before. Not fear, but the absolute focused gravity of a man who has seen enough of the world to know when something is about to land. He bought something at that hardware store. We don't know what. He's 12 minutes from your street. Okay, Ethan said. His own voice surprised him steady. Steadier than he had any reasonable right to be. Your mother needs to leave the trailer right now, Grizzly said. Rosa is outside. She'll take her to the compound. Ethan looked at his mother. She'd already put the book down. She'd heard the word trailer, and she was already moving, not panicked, just purposeful, the way women move when they've decided that dignity requires refusing to panic. I'm not leaving you here, Linda said. Mom, he stood up. Rosa's outside, please. Ethan, please. He crossed the kitchen and took both her hands and looked at her. I need to know you're somewhere I don't have to worry about. I can't do this right and worry about you at the same time. She looked at him, at her son's face still carrying the fading yellow of the bruise across his cheekbones, still wearing the eyes of a boy she'd raised, and somehow also a man she was only now fully meeting. You be careful, she said, or I will never forgive you. I know, he said. She squeezed his hands and let go and walked out the door. He waited until he heard Rosa's bike start and pull away. Then he stood in the kitchen of the trailer that smelled like mildew and the good years and the hard years all compressed together, and he breathed and he waited. His phone buzzed. Iron Wolf security cameras installed in the garage last week are live. Dennis's lot. We have eyes. Don't go outside. Ethan frowned at the screen. Then his stomach dropped. He typed back the garage. He's not coming to the trailer. 3 seconds. Iron Wolf. Change of direction. He drove past your street. He's at the garage now. Then Dennis. Ethan was already moving. I know. He called Dennis while running to the motorcycle. The phone rang 4 times. 5, 6. He threw his leg over the bike and the call connected. And Dennis said, yeah. And then Ethan heard something in the background, a voice that wasn't Dennis's loud and edged with the particular pitch of a man who had been drinking for 5 hours and had arrived somewhere he'd decided was the site of a reckoning. Dennis, Ethan said sharply. It's fine, Dennis said. His voice had the overdone calm of a man who is looking directly at a situation that is not fine. Everything's fine. Get out of the garage, Ethan said. Kid, I think you should. Dennis, get out of the building right now, please. In the background, Tyler's voice. Where is he? Where is Carter? Then a crash. Something metallic. Something heavy falling. Dennis. The line went to noise. Ethan rode. He covered the distance in 8 minutes flat, which was 4 minutes faster than legal and about 6 minutes faster than safe. And he turned into the garage lot, and the first thing he saw was Dennis standing outside the bay door with his arms crossed and his jaw set and blood on his hand from something. And behind him in the dim interior of the garage, the shape of Tyler Reed with an aluminum baseball bat. The same bat or another one, it didn't matter. The image was the same. Ethan killed the engine and got off the bike. Hey, he walked toward the bay entrance. His voice came out even. Tyler? Dennis turned. Ethan, don't. Go call the police, Dennis, Ethan said. He didn't look at Dennis when he said it. He kept his eyes on Tyler, right now from across the street. Dennis looked at him for a moment, the look of a man assessing whether the person he's looking at has taken complete leave of their senses, and then something in Ethan's face apparently convinced him that this was a deliberate choice and not a suicidal one because Dennis uncrossed his arms and walked away, slowly registering his objection through pace, but away. Tyler turned at the sound of Ethan's footsteps. He looked terrible. Not in the way of the man who'd been beaten, in the way of a man who had been unraveled. The golden quarterback face was blotchy and swollen from hours of drinking. His clothes were wrong, uncharacteristically careless. He was holding the bat at his side and his knuckles were white on it, and his eyes had the particular quality of a man who has worked himself into a story where there is only one possible ending, and he is committed to it. You, Tyler said. Me, Ethan agreed. You know what you cost me? Not quite a question, more like the opening of an accusation he'd been building for weeks. I know what you cost yourself, Ethan said. He stopped about 10 feet away. Your father didn't betray you, Tyler. He cleaned up your mess, like he's always cleaned up your mess. And you're angry at him because for the first time the cleaning cost something you didn't want to pay. Tyler's face moved through something complicated. Don't talk about my father. You drove a man out of his business, Ethan said. His voice was calm but not quiet. Pete Ochoa, 22 years. Your family took that from him with 3 phone calls and a bought inspector, and you didn't even know his name, did you? He was just a line item. That has nothing to do with... It has everything to do with it, Ethan said. You've been living in a world where people like me don't have a response, where if you hit hard enough and spend enough money, the thing you did just disappears. And it worked. For years it worked. He looked at Tyler steadily. And then one Tuesday I walked into a diner and sat in the wrong booth and suddenly it stopped working. And that's what this is about. Not me, not the diner. You're standing in this garage because the world stopped working the way you needed it to work and you don't have any idea what to do about that. Tyler's grip shifted on the bat. Shut up. You're scared, Ethan said. Your father's scared. The whole thing you built your life on is scared. And instead of sitting with that and figuring out what it means you came here with a bat, he spread his hands slightly. Same bat, same plan. Hasn't worked twice. What makes you think the third time is different? Because there's nobody here to stop me this time, Tyler said. His voice cracked on the last word, just slightly. but it was there, and Ethan heard it. He heard what was underneath the anger and the bat and the 5 hours of drinking and the hole in the study wall. He heard the thing that Tyler Reed had never been allowed to express in a family that monetized strength and discarded weakness, that had raised him to believe that feelings were logistics, problems, and emotions were things that happened to other people. He heard a man who didn't know how to be lost. "Tyler," Ethan said, quieter now. "Put the bat down." "Don't." "Put it down," Ethan said. "Not because I'm threatening you, not because of who's watching or who's going to show up. Put it down because whatever you're trying to prove with it, you already know it won't work. You already know." Tyler stared at him. The bat was still in his hand, but something had changed in the geometry of his body. The absolute committed lean of a man about to swing had become something more uncertain, more unsteady, the posture of someone who arrived at a destination and found it wasn't what they'd imagined. "You don't know anything about me," Tyler said, but the crack was wider now. "I know you're 24 years old," Ethan said. "I know you're the only son of a man who is about to face federal charges and lose everything he spent his life building. I know that every friend you have right now is a friend because of money and status that is actively disappearing." He paused. "And I know that standing in this garage with that bat is the loneliest you have ever been in your life." The bat hit the concrete. Onpled not dropped deliberately, not a gesture of surrender, just released, like a hand opening because holding on had finally cost more than letting go. Tyler stood in the middle of the garage with empty hands in an expression that Ethan had absolutely never expected to see on his face. He was crying, not dramatically, not performing it. The involuntary, unmanaged tears of a man who has held something too tightly for too long and the container has finally given out. Ethan didn't move toward him. That would have been wrong, would have felt like an invasion of something private and fragile. He just stood there and let it happen and didn't look away because looking away would have been its own kind of cruelty. Outside, he could hear the first sirens. Dennis had made his call. And underneath the sirens, further away, the low familiar sound of Harley engines approaching. Tyler heard them too. He looked up. His face did something that was almost funny in its openness. The ears-back alertness of a man suddenly remembering where he was and what was coming. "Are they going to—" He stopped. "No," Ethan said. "They're not going to touch you." He picked up the bat from the floor, held it carefully. "But the police are going to arrest you because Dennis called them and this garage has cameras that have been recording since you walked in and you came here with a weapon and you damaged property and you threatened a man, and that is what is about to happen." Tyler looked at the cameras. He hadn't noticed them. Well, of course he hadn't noticed them. Men who believed they were untouchable never noticed the cameras. "My father," he started. "Your father," Ethan said carefully, "is not going to be in a position to help you with this one." He met Tyler's eyes. "This one is yours." The police cruiser pulled into the lot, then another. The Harleys pulled in behind them, not blocking, not threatening, just present, the way they were always present, arranged at the periphery, like a fact of the landscape. Grizzly stepped off his bike and stood with his arms crossed and watched. Two officers came through the bay entrance. They saw Tyler. They saw Ethan holding the bat carefully by the end. They saw the damage, the dented tool cabinet, the shattered side mirror on the Silverado Tyler had hit on his way through the bay. "That him?" one of the officers said to Ethan. "Yeah," Ethan said. "He dropped the bat when I walked in. It's on camera." The officer looked at the camera mounted in the corner, looked at Ethan, then at Tyler. Tyler didn't run. To his credit, the only credit available to him in this moment, he didn't run. He stood with his empty hands and his ruined face, and he let them put the cuffs on without making it worse. As they walked him past Ethan toward the cruiser, Tyler stopped. "Run." The officer let him stop for a moment. Tyler looked at Ethan. His face was a map of everything that had happened to him in the last 2 months. The arrogance and the cruelty and the entitlement, and underneath all of that, now visible for the first time, the hollow place where something more solid should have been built and wasn't. "Why didn't you just stay in your booth?" Tyler said. Not angry this time, something closer to genuine bewilderment, like he was asking a question about physics, about a law of the universe that had stopped working. Ethan thought about it. Because he needed someone, Ethan said. And I was there. Tyler looked at him for another moment. Then the officer moved, and he moved with them, and the cruiser door closed, and it was over. Ethan stood in the garage with the bat in his hand, and the cameras recording, and the sound of engines idling outside. Dennis reappeared in the bay doorway. He looked at the dented cabinet, the broken mirror, the general disorder of a space he kept immaculate. He looked at Ethan. "The Silverado's mirror is going to run me $200, Dennis said. "I'll pay for it," Ethan said immediately. "You absolutely will not," Dennis said. He took the bat from Ethan's hand and carried it to the corner and leaned it against the wall. "I'll put it on Reed's tab." He looked around the garage with the expression of a man taking stock. "You okay?" "Yeah," Ethan said. "That was a brave and extremely stupid thing you did," Dennis said. "Sending me away and talking him down yourself." "I know," Ethan said. "Don't do it again." "I won't," Ethan said. Dennis looked at him with 30 years of human observation on his face. "You're lying," he said, not unkindly. He picked up his coffee from the workbench and went back to the office. Grizzly was in the bay entrance. The big man looked around the garage, looked at Ethan, looked at the spot where the bat had been on the floor. "You talked him down," Grizzly said. Not quite a question. "He talked himself down," Ethan said. "I just didn't get out of the way." Grizzly looked at him for a long moment with that expression, the one Ethan had first seen in the diner when their eyes met across the room, the one that had started all of this, the one that was something older than gratitude and more serious than approval. "Iron Wolf released the evidence 2 hours ago," Grizzly said. "Federal investigators in the Republic. It's already moving." Ethan leaned against the workbench. "It's done," he said. "Charles Reed's lawyers are going to fight it," Grizzly said. "That's going to take time. But the outcome," he shook his head slowly, "the outcome is already decided. You can't put that back in the bottle." Ethan nodded. Outside, one by one, the bikes were shutting off their engines. The lot was filling with the quiet that follows something finished. Men were talking in low voices. Someone laughed short, released the laugh of tension, finding its exit. "My mother," Ethan said. "She's fine. Rose is bringing her back." Grizzly paused. "She sent a message, actually." Ethan looked up. "She said..." Grizzly's mouth did something that was almost a smile. "She said tell him I'm proud of him, but if he did something reckless, I will be considerably less proud when I see him." Ethan felt something so large and warm move through his chest that he had to look at the ceiling for a moment. "That's accurate," he said. He looked at the bay, at the dented cabinet and the broken mirror, and the concrete floor where an aluminum bat had fallen from hands that had finally lost the grip. He thought about Tyler in the back of that cruiser. Thought about what awaited him, not just the legal process, which was bad enough, but the particular unmooring of a man whose entire identity was built on the scaffolding of his father's power, and whose scaffolding was now publicly and irreversibly coming down. He didn't feel triumphant. He felt something more complicated and more honest than triumph. The feeling of something having landed, having completed the arc it needed to complete, without any of the clean satisfaction that stories promised when you were young and still believed justice was simple. "What happens to Tyler now?" he said, not asking Grizzly exactly, more asking the air. "He goes through what he goes through," Grizzly said. "That's his road to walk. Yours is different." Ethan looked at him. "What's mine?" he said. Grizzly considered that for a moment with the deliberateness of a man who doesn't offer things he hasn't weighed. "I think," Grizzly said slowly, "that yours is the one where you find out what you're actually made of when things aren't trying to break you." He looked at Ethan steadily. "That's the harder road, kid. Anybody can find out who they are in a crisis. It's what you do after the crisis that tells you who you actually are." Ethan stood in the garage and absorbed that. Outside, a motorcycle started, then another. The familiar build of the sound he'd learned over these weeks, the particular chord of many engines finding their rhythm together. His phone buzzed. His mother Rosa says, "You're fine. Tell me you're fine." He typed back, "I'm fine. I'll explain everything when you get home. I love you." Her reply came in 4 seconds, "I love you too. And we're having a talk about reckless decisions, young man." He put the phone in his pocket and looked at Grizzly. "She's going to be terrifying about this," he said. "Good," Grizzly said. You should have someone terrifying about it. He moved toward his bike, then stopped, turned back. Ethan. Yeah, tonight at the compound, Grizzly said. There's something Iron Wolf wants to do. He paused. The almost smile came back, and this time it completed itself. Bring your mother. She should see it. He walked out. Ethan stood alone in Dennis's garage and listened to the engines and thought about the word that Grizzly hadn't said, because it didn't need to be said, because he'd felt it building for weeks in the accumulated weight of rebuilt motorcycles and paid tuitions and bodies positioned between him and harm, and old men rebuilding his bike in their spare time and bad coffee outside CVS, and a man named Dutch calling to say he'd been watching a bar for 2 hours because that's just what you did. He didn't need the word. He already knew what it meant. Linda Carter had never been to a motorcycle compound in her life, and she handled it the way she handled most things that were new and slightly alarming. She walked in, looked around, assessed, and then decided to simply be exactly who she was and let everyone else adjust accordingly. Rosa brought her through the compound entrance at 7:15, 40 minutes after Ethan had arrived on his own, and the first thing Linda did was look across the crowd of leather-vested men and find her son's face. She looked at him for exactly 3 seconds, the full maternal scan, top to bottom, checking for new damage, and then she nodded once satisfied that he had not acquired any fresh injuries in the hours since they'd last spoken, and turned her attention to meeting the people around her. Ethan watched this happen from across the compound and felt something loosen in his chest that had been tightening since the moment he'd sent her out the door with Rosa that morning. Dutch got to her first. He extended a hand and introduced himself, and within 4 minutes they were deep in a conversation about diesel engine calibration that Ethan could not have contributed to, which was humbling, given that he fixed engines for a living. Rosa appeared with food, an enormous plate loaded offered with the directness of a woman who expressed care through feeding people, and Linda accepted it with genuine warmth and sat down at the wooden table near the fire as if she had been sitting at that table for years. Grizzly appeared beside Ethan. She fits, the big man said simply. She fits everywhere, Ethan said. She just decides to, and then she does. You got that from her, Grizzly said. Ethan looked at him. The part where you just decide, Grizzly said. In the diner, in the parking lot, the garage today. You just decide and then you do. That doesn't come from nowhere. He nodded toward Linda. It came from her. Ethan watched his mother make Dutch laugh at something, the real laugh, the surprise kind, and thought about 30 years of his mother deciding things. Deciding to get up after his father died. Deciding to work the laundromat shifts back to back without complaining. Deciding that Ethan would go to school and that insulin would be purchased and that the lights would stay on through sheer force of applied will. A lifetime of quiet decisions that looked like ordinary life from the outside and were from the inside acts of continuous, extraordinary courage. Yeah, he said softly. It did. Iron Wolf came through the compound at 8 o'clock with the particular purposeful movement that parted groups without requiring him to speak. Men stepped aside naturally, conversations paused, heads turned. He moved to the center of the fire and turned to face the compound, and the noise settled the way noise settles when the person who needs quiet has entered a room. Ethan felt his pulse shift. Grizzly's hand landed briefly on his shoulder. Not gripping, just present. About 3 months ago, Iron Wolf began his voice carrying cleanly without being raised. A man came to our attention in a diner on Route 66. He looked at Ethan across the fire. None of you need me to tell you what happened there. You already know. Some of you were in that parking lot when it was over. Some of you watched this kid go to work and go to school and handle what was being thrown at him without once asking for more than we were already giving. The compound was completely quiet. What I want to say, Iron Wolf continued, is not about what Ethan did for Mason. What Mason needed, Ethan provided, and that's a debt we honor, that's who we are. But that's not what makes this moment different. He paused. What makes this moment different is who Ethan Carter has shown himself to be across every single day since that Tuesday. Not just in one act, not just in a crisis, in the long, unglamorous day-by-day proof of character that is the only reliable measure of a man we've ever found. He looked around the compound. I've known men who were brave once and small every other day of their lives. That's not what this is. This is something else, and we recognize it. He looked at Ethan directly now. "Come here," he said. Ethan's legs moved before his brain fully processed the instruction. He crossed the compound with the particular awareness of a man who knows he is walking through a moment he will remember for the rest of his life, not the dramatic filtered version, but the real one, complete with the fire smell and the dust under his boots and the weight of 40 pairs of eyes and his mother watching from the table near the edge. He stopped in front of Iron Wolf. Iron Wolf reached to the man beside him, Carver, who had been standing just outside Ethan's sightline, and took something from him. Leather. Dark, worn at the edges in the specific way that meant use and not neglect. The kind of jacket that had been somewhere, that had accumulated its softness through years of being exactly what it was. It was not a new jacket. Ethan understood, looking at it, that it being old was the point, that it meant something specific and serious, that it wasn't new. "No patch yet," Iron Wolf said. "That comes after time and process and a conversation with the full membership, and we do things the right way." He held the jacket out. "But this means you have people. This means when you ride, you don't ride alone. This means we see you, all of you, and we are telling you formally in front of everyone here that you are one of ours." Ethan took the jacket. He stood holding it for a moment, feeling the weight of it, not heavy, but weighted the difference between an object and an object that means something. He put it on. It fit. He didn't know why that detail hit him as hard as it did the simple, uncomplicated fact that it fit. But something about it broke through the last wall he'd been holding up, the last careful internal architecture of not allowing himself to fully feel the magnitude of what had happened to his life in 3 months, and he felt it land. He felt it all land. The diner, the parking lot after with 20 headlights, and a hug from a man the size of a truck. Dutch's hands rebuilding his motorcycle. The anonymous tuition. The coffee outside CVS. Dennis's wife's sandwiches. Rosa. Carver. The compound on a Saturday night, feeling for the first time like somewhere he was supposed to be. His mother fitting in as if she'd always been here. All of it. Just 40 men around a fire started making noise, not polished, not choreographed, just the raw sound of people expressing something true, and Ethan stood in the middle of it in a leather jacket that had been somewhere, and he kept his eyes dry through what felt like a genuinely unreasonable amount of effort. Grizzly reached him first. The giant man put both arms around him, the same way he had in the parking lot 3 months ago, the hug that had started all of this, but different now. Less surprising, more like something that had always been going to be the shape of things. "Welcome," Grizzly said into his ear. Just that word. "Thank you," Ethan said back, 2 words that were still inadequate and probably always would be. "Stop thanking me," Grizzly said. He stepped back, and his eyes were doing something that Grizzly's eyes didn't usually do, and neither of them acknowledged it, because some things are more powerful when they're left unspoken. Then Linda was there. She had moved through the crowd with the quiet efficiency of a woman who had decided she was going somewhere and wasn't going to make a production of it, and she stood in front of her son in his leather jacket in the firelight, and she looked at him for a long moment. She put her hands on both sides of his face. "I see you," she said. Her voice didn't shake, because Linda Carter did not allow her voice to shake. But there was something in it that was the voice under the voice, the one that only Ethan could hear because he was her son, and he'd been hearing the real version of her voice his whole life underneath all the practical ones. "Your father would have seen you too." Ethan covered her hands with his. He couldn't speak for a moment. He didn't need to. The news about Charles Reed broke in the Arizona Republic on a Friday morning 6 weeks later. And the headline was measured. Federal investigators in indictment and racketeering were words that newspapers handled carefully, but the story underneath it was not measured at all. It was meticulous. 18 months of investigative reporting supplemented by documentation from a source the paper described only as a longtime community figure, named names and dates and numbers, with the quiet, devastating precision of journalism that had been built carefully and was now impossible to ignore. Ethan read it on his phone at the garage. Dennis appeared in the bay door, said nothing, set a cup of coffee on the workbench, and went back to the office. And Charles Reed's frozen assets were announced the following Tuesday. His business partners began issuing statements by Wednesday. The county sheriff who had received Charles Reed's phone calls and acted on them for 15 years quietly submitted his resignation on Thursday morning, citing personal reasons, which was the language men used when the real reason was obvious to everyone. Tyler had pleaded guilty to criminal threatening and vandalism charges the week before. He'd taken the deal his public defender, no longer his father's expensive attorneys, who had enough of their own problems, had negotiated, which meant probation and community service, and the end of any remaining athletic career and the beginning of whatever came after that. Ethan had not attended the proceedings. He hadn't needed to. Pete Ochoa called Ethan on a Wednesday afternoon. Ethan almost didn't recognize the name on the screen, then remembered and picked up. "I heard about you," Pete said. He had the voice of a man past 60 who had done physical work his whole life, rough and direct, no wasted words. "Iron Wolf told me what happened, how it started, how it ended up where it did." "Pete, I got a check," Pete said, "from a trust associated with the Reed estate. It's what my shop was worth. What I lost." A pause. Ethan could hear the weight of something in that pause. The specific gravity of a man receiving something back that he'd stopped expecting. "I'm not going to reopen. I'm too old for that. But my daughter's been wanting to start something. Small engine repair, lawnmowers, generators, that kind of thing." Another pause. "She's going to be able to do that now." Ethan leaned against the garage wall. "I'm glad," he said. It came out smaller than he meant. "I wanted to say thank you," Pete said. "I know you didn't do it for me. You didn't even know me. I know that. But the reason it happened was because of you, and I needed someone to know that I know that." Ethan didn't know what to say to that. "Thank you for calling," he said finally. "Tell your daughter good luck." "I will," Pete said. "You take care of yourself, son." The line went dead. Ethan put the phone in his pocket and went back to the engine he was rebuilding and worked in silence for 20 minutes. And if Dennis noticed that his employee's eyes were red-edged when he came out for lunch, Dennis had the wisdom and the grace to look somewhere else. 3 months after the night at the compound, Ethan started the apprenticeship. A custom motorcycle restoration shop on the north side of the city, the kind of place that had a waiting list and a reputation that traveled, had a position open. It had opened because a phone call was made by someone Ethan never directly identified, but who had a voice like gravel road and connections to most of the serious motorcycle work in northern Arizona. The owner, a compact woman in her 50s named Valentina, who had built the shop from nothing over 20 years and had opinions about restoration philosophy that were both rigid and completely correct, interviewed Ethan for an hour and a half. She tested him. Not aggressively, she wasn't interested in performance. She was interested in competence, but thoroughly. Showed him a 1967 Triumph Bonneville in pieces on a bench and asked him to tell her what he was looking at. He talked for 12 minutes straight, and she stopped him at the end and said, "Monday at 7, and that was the interview. He told Dennis. Dennis sat back in his office chair with the expression of a man who had been expecting something like this and had spent some time arranging his face to receive it correctly. "Good," Dennis said. "Dennis, Ethan started. "Don't." Dennis held up a hand. "We're not doing a speech. You were good at this job, and I was glad to have you, and now you're going somewhere better. And that's how it's supposed to work." He picked up his pen. "Come back and visit sometimes, and send people my way if they need simple work." "I will," Ethan said. "And Ethan," Dennis looked up. His face was doing the thing it rarely did, the thing underneath the professional surface that was the actual man. "I've been in this business 30 years. I've had a lot of employees. What you did in this garage, not just the skill, I mean all of it, the whole thing, that was something." He shook his head once like he was clearing it. "That was something." He looked back at his desk. Ethan nodded and walked out of the office and didn't look back because he knew if he looked back, it would be harder and some things were better completed with your eyes forward. Valentina's shop was different from everything Ethan had worked in before. It was the difference between fixing what was broken and building what should exist, between maintenance and craft. He learned things in the first 2 weeks that rewired his understanding of what he'd already known, and the learning felt like a door he hadn't known was in the wall suddenly being visible, and then open, and beyond it another room, and beyond that another door. He worked, he studied, he rode. He showed up at the compound on Friday nights with the same reliability he'd shown up to shifts at the garage, not because he had to, not because he was performing gratitude, but because it had become the place where a week ended and something in him could exhale. where Dutch argued about engines and Rosa talked about the carburetor on her 72 Sportster, and Grizzly drank his coffee, black, and said exactly as many words as the situation required, which was often fewer than expected and always exactly right. So Iron Wolf joined him at the fire one Friday 6 months after the night with the jacket. They sat without talking for a while. This was something Ethan had learned, that the men around him used silence differently than most people did. Not as absence, as a form of presence. Valentina says you're exceptional, Iron Wolf said finally. She told me I rebuilt a cam chain wrong last week, Ethan said. She tells everyone they rebuilt something wrong when they're learning, Iron Wolf said. She told me I don't understand Triumph carburetors the first time I brought a bike in. I've been taking bikes there for 11 years. Ethan looked at him. Iron Wolf's mouth moved in that nearly their way. She also said you understand things that she doesn't usually see until someone's been in the trade for a decade. So, he looked at the fire. Both things are true. They sat. Can I ask you something, Ethan said. Yes. When you walked into that country club with the folder, Ethan said slowly, did you know he was going to fold? Like, were you certain? Iron Wolf considered the question seriously. He didn't offer fast answers, which was one of the things about him that Ethan had come to respect most profoundly. I knew the evidence was real, Iron Wolf said. I knew what it would cost him if it went public. I knew that Charles Reed was at his core a man whose entire motivation was self-preservation, and that self-preservation and protecting Tyler were in that moment in direct conflict. He paused. But certain number men like Charles Reed sometimes choose the cliff over the surrender. It happens. You can't always predict which way pride breaks. But you went anyway, Ethan said. I went anyway, Iron Wolf said simply, because the alternative was letting a man we had the ability to stop continue doing what he'd been doing. And I don't live with that kind of thing well. He looked at Ethan. Neither do you. That's why you're here. Ethan looked at the fire. He thought about the booth in the diner, the coffee that had gone cold while he watched Tyler Reed stand over a sick man. The moment when his legs had made their decision before his brain had voted. He thought about every version of the person he'd been before that Tuesday, the one who calculated, who kept his head down, who understood the mathematics of survival and operated within them without complaint. He thought about who he was now, not dramatically different, not transformed into something unrecognizable. The same person, same blue eyes, same tendency to fix things that were broken, same love for his mother, same stubbornness that Dennis had identified correctly and Grizzly had recognized from across a parking lot full of headlights. But expanded, widened, carrying more now than he'd known he could carry, and understanding that the capacity had always been there waiting for the moment that called it forward. I keep thinking about something, Ethan said. Iron Wolf waited. Tyler asked me in the garage at the end why I didn't just stay in my booth. He looked at his hands, like it was a choice that didn't make sense to him, like he genuinely didn't understand the mechanism. It doesn't make sense, Iron Wolf said, to someone who has never once thought about another person's experience as a real thing, who has lived entirely inside the logic of what benefits Tyler Reed. He paused. You confused him, deeply, because you operated on a logic he didn't have a category for. Empathy, Ethan said. Something older than that word, Iron Wolf said. The thing that makes one human being unable to walk past another human being's suffering and pretend it isn't happening. Some people have it. Some people have it beaten out of them. Some people were raised in environments that never gave it room to develop. He was quiet for a moment. You had it. You used it. And it changed things. Grizzly settled onto the bench on Ethan's other side with a coffee cup and the particular economy of motion of a large man who has learned to take up exactly the space he needs. The three of them sat. The fire, the Arizona night, the sound of voices and engines, and the ongoing complicated music of a group of people who had chosen each other, which was the only choice that ever finally meant anything. Ethan reached into the pocket of the leather jacket, the jacket that had been somewhere that had been given to him on a night that had already become the before and after line of his life, and he felt the worn seam at the bottom of the pocket that someone's hands had worn smooth over years of the same gesture. He thought about the person who'd worn it before him, someone he'd never know, someone who had sat at fires like this one and carried whatever they'd carried and made whatever choices they'd made and eventually handed the jacket on to the next person who needed it. That was how it worked. That was how it had always worked. But not through perfect people or clean stories or situations that resolved without residue. Through ordinary people who hit a moment that required them to be extraordinary and discovered to their own surprise that they could be. And then through the people who saw that and said, you are one of us, and meant it. Ethan looked at Grizzly, at Iron Wolf, at Dutch across the fire who was probably wrong about something mechanical and completely certain he was right, and at Rosa beside him who was definitely right, and building her case with the patience of a woman who had learned that being right was only half the work. At Carver, who said little and meant everything he said. At 40 men and women who had decided through the long evidence of their lives that loyalty was not a sentiment, but a practice, and who practiced it with the same daily commitment that Ethan brought to rebuild engines and his mother brought to insulin schedules, and Linda Carter brought to surviving every hard thing the world had aimed at her. He was 23 years old. He had a job that was teaching him who he was professionally. He had a mother who was healthy and safe and had an ongoing argument with Dutch about diesel engines that showed no signs of resolution. He had a community college transcript that was quietly becoming something he was proud of. And he had this fire, these people, this jacket, this Friday night, this specific and irreplaceable weight of belonging that he hadn't known he was missing until the moment it arrived and named itself. Some men spend their whole lives looking for their people in the places they were told to look, in the approved categories, in the expected configurations, and die having never found them. Ethan Carter had found his in a diner on Route 66 by refusing to look away. That was all it had taken. One refusal, one pair of feet that stayed planted, one voice that said the words before the brain had any say in the matter. And everything, absolutely everything, had followed from that. He put his hands around the coffee cup Grizzly had wordlessly handed him and felt the warmth of it against his palms and looked at the fire and understood in the clearest and most unambiguous way he had ever understood anything in his 23 years of living that the boy nobody noticed had become, through one act of stubborn human decency, a man that 40 people would move mountains for. Not because he was special, because he had refused to pretend that someone else's pain was not his business. And in a world that taught you from the very beginning to stay in your booth, that single refusal was the most extraordinary thing a person could do.